Welcome to the January 2009 Institute for Jewish Christian Understanding's First Friday program. My name is Sarah Schramm, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you today the director of the IJCU, Dr. Peter Pettit. Dr. Pettit is in his 10th year as director here at Muhlenberg College, having previously served as a Lutheran pastor in a congregation in Riverside, California. He has taught in several colleges and seminaries in Southern California and in many congregations both there and in this area. He has been a research fellow at both the University of Judaism in Los Angeles and Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and maintains a scholarly connection with the interfaith program of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He advises the National Bishop of the Lutheran Church as a member of the Consultative Panel on Lutheran-Jewish Relations. His most recent publications are two chapters, one on covenant and one on the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the panel's study volume called The Covenantal Conversations. He has also published the article on the Hebrew Bible in the Cambridge Dictionary of Christian-Jewish Relations, along with several briefer entries. His current publishing project is developing an online resource to provide Christian preachers with authentic Judaica to convey the virtues and values of the church's Sunday Bible readings. None of that makes him particularly expert in today's topic, but some in our planning group heard him one day succinctly narrate the history of these borders and found it very helpful. We realize that many of us lack the basic background to understand exactly what it is at stake when we talk about these borders. He agreed to make a run at putting together a presentation to give us just that background, and I'm pleased to welcome him to the podium to draw some lines in the sand, the borders of Israel and Palestine through the years. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the Morning Call for picking up our announcement and giving us fairly prominent notice this morning. Who knew when we set this topic several months ago the timeliness of what we would be dealing with? Clearly, we all arrive, I think, today with many emotions and questions, opinions, concerns, fears, ideas, perhaps expectations relative to the topic that's been announced and also what's happening in Israel and Gaza as we speak. We've chosen not to refocus today's presentation, which certainly has some relevance but doesn't directly apply to the events currently underway in Israel and Gaza. Rather, we'll proceed with the program as scheduled, and I will be happy to entertain questions and discussion about it in the context of current events when we come to our question and answer. I think that's the fairest way to respect our announced topic and also the urgency of what we bring with us today as we gather. Let me also suggest before we begin that we take a moment to gather our thoughts in silence, and if you will, to offer prayer for those who are suffering in this ongoing conflict, for those who lead their nations and people in the quest for peace, for those in harm's way by virtue of duty or happenstance or manipulation or any other reason, and for lasting peace. Muhlenberg is affiliated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and that church participates in an ecumenical cycle of prayer in which the churches in various states take a day of the month to pray for peace in the Middle East. It so happens that Pennsylvania's day is the 9th of each month. And so I would share with you a prayer written by a Palestinian-American Lutheran, a Palestinian-American Lutheran pastor in Illinois, which he offers in this moment. Lord God, bless all your children in the Middle East with the gift of peace. Reach out and embrace Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Dry their tears with your gentle hands. Surround their trembling bodies with your loving arms. Replace their fears with the hope and vision of peaceful times to come. Amen. And I invite you to join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. So, we consider the borders of Israel and Palestine through the years. Clearly, this topic is shaped by modern concerns, the Israel and Palestine of today and their conflict over borders and nationhood. But the names date back to biblical times, and I'm going to start there and fairly quickly bring us up to the 20th century, but I think it's essential to have some of that background because of some of the critical moments that take place in it. By the end of my presentation, I think I'll be able to present you with 6 crucial turning points in the identification of Israel and Palestine and their borders, which can help orient us as we think about identities, geographies, nation, people, etc. So that's what I'm aiming for, is a reasonably full account that ultimately brings us to a focus on 6 key moments at which we can see how these terms and territories relate to each other. If we go back to biblical times, our earliest source for both Israel and Palestine as names is the Bible. Israel is a patronymic land name. It's named for the ancestral figure Israel. Depending on how critically you read the Bible, you may say that that the ancestor was actually named for the land, but I'm not going to get into that. In any event, the people and the land are closely tied in their name. Peleshet is the land on the southwestern coast of this area of the Mediterranean coast, which also refers to a regional territory. And Plishtim in Hebrew is the name of the people, or what we come to know as the Philistines. We'll see that this Plishtim becomes Palestine under Roman influence in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And from there it develops to today's Palestine. Israel, of course, continued to be the name of a people and often of their national homeland, which also frequently was named in liturgy and in poetry and even in political writings by its principal site, Zion. And so Zionism becomes the name for a movement that would develop this land of Israel as the Jewish national homeland. But I get ahead of myself already. Just to give a bit of broader orientation in the ancient Near East, Canaan shows here on this map, appropriately so, as the general name for the region or land in which both Israel and Peleshet are located. And the Jewish ancestors in the biblical account often describe their land as the land of Canaan. And you can see the surrounding, to get the general geography, we have Egypt in the northeast corner of the African continent here. We have the Arabian Peninsula. We move over up into southeastern Europe and Asia Minor here with the Hittite Empire, what's modern-day Turkey. And of course, off to the east, across the Great Desert, you move into the land of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, ancient Babylon and Assyria, modern-day Iraq and Iran, just to get general orientation. The area that we're going to be talking about is generally bounded by the middle of this eastern coast of the Mediterranean, the Rift Valley that runs down through the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, the Jordan River Valley, the Arava, and down to the Gulf of Aqaba, around Sinai and back up to the Mediterranean. So generally, that is the territory that at one time or another we will be talking about today. Now, prior to the settlement of the people who identify themselves as Israelites, There are a number of tribes in the region that are identified in the Bible repeatedly, often known as the seven nations, although they actually number upwards of 11 or 12 by the time you're done with various lists. And you can see that the Philistines, are down here on the southwestern coast of the territory. Here's the Dead Sea, right? Here's the Sea of Galilee up above. And this is the area in which the Philistines were settled. When the tribes of Israel settle the land and distribute themselves, we read about their various territories. You can see the 12 of them variously deployed out here. And you also see that still listed here in that coastal area is the land of the Philistines. When you read the scripture, while the commandment apparently is to eradicate all of the seven nations, or that God will drive them all out in front of the Israelites, when you read Israelite history, what you find out is they didn't exactly go very far. Because the prophets, the kings, the residents of Israel are constantly dealing with the influence of these foreign, what they see as foreign nations and their different worship. And if in fact all these peoples had been eradicated or driven out of the land, we would assume that the Bible would have had next to nothing to say about them once that had been accomplished. Since Israel's history is one long recitation of don't get involved with these people, we have to assume that they all lived side by side with greater degrees of peace and conflict at different times. When we come to the year 1000 and the accession of David to the throne, we get for the first time something that one could call a state of Israel, outlined here in the red dotted line. It's known as the United Monarchy. It lasts as long as David and his son Solomon, for roughly 80 years, following which the monarchy is divided between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and you have two nations now, Judah in the south, or Judea. That only depends on how you want to transliterate it. It's not a different name, Judah or Judea. And Israel becomes the name of the northern kingdom. Notice that we still have Philistia and the Philistines down here in that place along the coast, which is so clearly identified with them. To look more closely at that, you can see that the land of the Philistines here on the western side of Judah and the southwestern corner of Israel includes some cities that we're very familiar with still today: Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Also Gat and Ekron were two of the key Philistine centers more inland. Israel, of course, as the northern kingdom, is destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 before the Common Era, and at that point the so-called 12 lost tribes, the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, leaves the scene of history. And it is Judah which continues on for another roughly 130 years. Following the Babylonian exile, late in the 6th century, Persia was in charge of the Middle East, and we see here some familiar names of Ashdod and Yehud and Samaria, Megiddo, Galilee, Idumea, Moab, Ammon, two of the older nations on the eastern side of the Dead Sea and the Jordan. But actually we see nothing here of either Israel or Philistia. Right? Israel, as the northern kingdom, had been destroyed by the Assyrians in 722, and in the edict of the Persian ruler Cyrus sending the Jews back after exile to this territory, consistently says that he sends them to Jerusalem in Judah. So the territory at that time is known as Judah, although the book of Ezra still refers to the people as Israelites. Okay? And there are references to the families in Israel. And whether that exactly means the people, the Israelites, or whether that exactly means a land, is not clear from the text in Ezra. We are moving rather quickly here, you may have noticed, but moving this Persian arrangement gives way to the hegemony of the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great. Still, we find Philistia and the Philistines referred to in a very general sense, but none of the Hellenistic divisions of Alexander's reign carry either Israel or Philistia as proper titles. By the time we come to the 1st century and what are sometimes called New Testament times, we again see some of these same districts still referred to: Judea, Samaria, the Galilee. We now get some new, the Decapolis, the association of 10 cities over here on the eastern side, Perea, which is more or less in the area of Moab. But still at this point, no Israel or Palestine proper. So when do these start to come back into broad use? The Emperor Hadrian ruled from 76 to 138. Following the Bar Kokhba revolt of 135, famously plows under the temple, declares Judea capta. Judea has been captured as it's imprinted on the Roman coins of the time, bars Jews from the city of Jerusalem, and takes the name of Paleshet, Palestina, from that southwestern region, and now chooses it to name the entire region up and down the eastern coast of the Mediterranean as Provincia Palestina. And so at this point, Hadrian really sets the terms that, for practical purposes, will continue to obtain for another roughly 1,800 years as Palestine becomes the broadly accepted term of reference politically for this whole region. So we see in a map of the Roman Empire at about 395, there are a couple of districts here. District 1, District 6, and District 7 are all segments of a Palestina district within the Roman Empire. And you can see it comes from just below Tyre and Sidon, down along the Rift Valley to the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. That's not the Arabian Peninsula, and back up. As we move along to the Arab Caliphate after the 7th century, the name holds so that we have the Jund of Damascus, the Jund of Al-Urdun in the north, and then the Jund of Philistine, again clearly reflecting the Palestina-Philistine heritage. In Ottoman Palestine, the entire region can be referred to as Palestine, although there's no actual administrative district by that name. It is referenced as a region, but the administrative districts tend to take their name in the Ottoman Empire more from the cities. So we have the Sanjak of Jerusalem, the Sanjak of Nablus, the Sanjak of Acre, the Sanjak of Beirut, the Sanjak of Damascus, etc. And those districts, and then we get the larger, some of the major cities. The Vilayat of Beirut represents the whole coastal group of all those Sanjaks, and the Vilayat of Syria, or sometimes known as the Vilayat of Damascus, the inland group on the plateau. With that, you have successfully joined me in a journey of approximately 3,500 years. And I think, and I've done it quickly because surely the issues that plague this discussion in the 20th and 21st centuries become far more complicated and detailed in the last 115 years. But there is background to this. It's not as though things started at the end of World War I and we can just pick it up there and tell the story. There is a long history to both of these names, some of it colloquial and conventional and describing regions and peoples, some of it traceable within the political history of the powers that ruled this area. And those references are not always matching each other. So it's very difficult to trace an absolutely straight line. Through this whole period, there are people who refer to this region following Hadrian and the Romans as Palestine. Through this whole period, there are people who refer to this land consistently as Israel or Zion. But they do so as a part of a heritage within their own community that may or may not have any bearing or relationship to the way that the political powers of the time are actually describing the land. Okay, so let's move it to the 20th century. The upheavals of two world wars, which figure prominently in this whole question. Following World War I, the great powers and the League of Nations established a mandatory system. That doesn't mean required, that means they gave mandates to people in order to shepherd new nations to maturity. France and England in 1916, in a secret Sykes-Picot agreement, had already more or less agreed after the war to split the Middle East into a northern French zone and a southern British zone. And in the clauses of the League of Nations establishing the British mandatory authority, that southern zone is assigned to England, and this entire zone is known as the Palestine Mandate. Okay, Yes, it says British Mandate. It's the British Mandate for Palestine. It's actually known as the Palestine Mandate. The map is not well labeled. However, in addition to the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917, which assured the Jewish community of British efforts to establish a national Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the prepositions are everything sometimes, the Brits had also made a number of promises, mostly verbal, a few on paper, about freedom and autonomy and sovereignty to various Arab leaders during the war. And a key outcome of those promises was that almost as soon as the British got the mandate for Palestine, they separated off everything east of the Jordan, called it Transjordan. They didn't invent the name, they referred to it by its conventional name of Transjordan, and which is about 70% of the whole mandate. And they transferred effective sovereignty to the Hashemite Sheikh Abdullah. And henceforth, that would be known for the next 2 decades as Transjordan, and now distinguished from what remained of the Palestine Mandate, which was the area west of the Jordan River. Transjordan was in 1946 to become the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The western segment of the Mandate now became known as Palestine, and everyone who lived in it was Palestinian, whether they were Muslim, Arab, Jew, Christian, Armenian, or whatever. If you lived in this area, you were referred to as Palestinian. So we have extensive records from the time referring to Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Christians. Palestine was the geographical area within which a mixed population lived together. Following World War II, the British sought to get out of the Mandate And the United Nations developed a plan to partition this remaining western portion of the Mandate, now known as Palestine, into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Neither one of those states was named in the UN documents. It was a Jewish state and an Arab state. The plan was approved by a vote of 33 to 13 in the United Nations on November 29th of 1947. And the map on the left shows the proposed borders of the Jewish state in white, right, and the Arab state in orange. Okay. I'm sorry. And an internationally controlled area around Jerusalem, which would be part of neither state, but rather under international administration. But this was not to be. The Arab states had voted against the partition at the United Nations. They rejected the concept of partitioning the land. And when the British withdrew on May 15, 1948, and the Jewish state declared its independence and named itself Israel, the Arab armies of Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon attacked. Right. By the end of the fighting, a year later, the armistice lines were drawn where you see them in the right-hand map, with the orange being Jordanian, right, the red being Egyptian, what we know as the Gaza Strip, right, and the blue, both light blue and darker blue, being Israel. Now, the lines on the armistice map in 1949 were actually drawn with a green pen. And so these borders, and particularly the borders between Jordan and Israel right around this area, right, came to be, it was literally a green line on the map. And so it came to be known as the Green Line. And if you hear people refer to Green Line Israel, what they're talking about is the Israel defined by these borders and by that green line designating the point of armistice or ceasefire in 1949. As yet, there was no Palestine to speak of in a political sense, although some will make a case for the existence of Palestinians who now lived under either Israeli or Egyptian or Jordanian control. Because after all of the people who lived in this area were Palestinians. But rather than being under the British Palestine Mandate, they now are under Israel, Egypt, or Jordan. And yet they might very well still refer to themselves as Palestinians and understand that they live in a place called Palestine. It was 1950 when King Hussein annexed this territory to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan that the term West Bank was born as a political division. Obviously, it's always been the West Bank of the Jordan River, but it's Hussein, in referring to this area and seeking to distance it from any of its Jewish heritage, who begins to use the term West Bank for that particular district within the Hashemite Kingdom. The next shift in borders, if you can call it that, takes place with the 1967 Six-Day War. The reason I say if you can call it that is that there are technically, in 1967, no borders yet, because there had been no resolution to the conflict of 1948-49. There were ceasefire lines, and that's what we were looking at on the previous slide, but with no peace, no treaties, there were as yet no actual fixed borders. Nevertheless, by 18 years later, there is clearly a status quo in which one can talk about now a change. The ceasefire collapsed in late May and early June of 1967. In 6 days, Israel had defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and taken control of a significant amount of territory. On the left side in the light blue, you see Green Line Israel. Okay? And then in the dark blue, the areas that came under Israeli control, that were captured by Israel during the Six-Day War: the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Without peace negotiations to settle the land claims after 1967 also, this occupation continued of necessity. It's in this context that the focus of reference for the term Palestine shifts again and really comes to its contemporary significance, I think. The organization that was formed in 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was clearly a group organized in Gaza and the West Bank for the liberation of Palestine. And by that, they meant British Mandatory Palestine apart from, well, they might even have meant including Jordan, as events several years later would bear out. But certainly their Palestine liberation goal was for the establishment of a national identity and a land and state in which Palestinian people would be at home, to establish a Palestinian national homeland. It was formed in 1964. It was identified by the Arab League in October of '74 as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And so at that point, the question of the West Bank and Gaza shifts from, in terms of who is it that Israel is dealing with, well, prior to 1974, one would have expected that they were dealing with Jordan, from which they had gained control of the West Bank, and for the Gaza Strip with Egypt. But with the acknowledgement by the Arab League of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in '74, now Israel is dealing with the PLO, or subsequently the Palestinian Authority. Similarly, in 1993, as part of the Oslo peace process, the Israeli government recognized the PLO and its successor, the PA, Palestinian Authority, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So now Palestine becomes the name of the homeland to which Palestinians aspire in their relations with Israel and their Arab neighbors. The borders of that Palestine remain undetermined, pending final negotiations between Israel and the PA. But again, I get ahead of myself. Because in 1979, Anwar Sadat brought Egypt into a peace treaty with Israel, and control of the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt in 3 stages of withdrawal, and these 3 bands represent the successive redeployment lines of Israeli military forces, and concurrent with the redeployment of the military, also the withdrawal of civilian populations which had been moved into settlements across the Sinai Peninsula. The Gaza Strip, which had been captured from Egypt up here on the coast, was relinquished by Egypt and became one focus of the efforts of the PLO along with the West Bank. And so we move to the year 2000, because with 1993 and 94, Israel recognizes the PLO recognizes Israel, and the Oslo peace process begins. We don't have time to go into all the details of the way in which the transfer of both military and civil authority in the West Bank and Gaza was to proceed, and did proceed through the Oslo years. But the culmination of Oslo was initially projected to take place in the year 2000 at the Camp David summit. And at Camp David, where these final agreements were to be reached, again, it was not to be. No actual maps were drawn and distributed at Camp David. So there are no physical objects that we can point to and say, this is what the Palestinians understood, this is what the Israelis offered, this is what the Americans suggested. That's all in verbiage. It's not on maps. And there is dispute between the Palestinians and the Israelis and Americans about what was put on the table, what was offered. The Palestinians claim that the offer of Palestinian independence did not include territorial contiguity, but rather divided Palestine into 4 cantons: a northern West Bank up here, a central West Bank here, a southern West Bank down here, and Gaza over there, of course. And that they would always have to pass through Israeli border control and Israeli territory anytime they wanted to move within, quote, within Palestine. That's the picture on the left, as you can see. The Israelis and Dennis Ross, who was the chief U.S. negotiator, say that the offer that was made, in fact, did include territorial contiguity throughout the West Bank, as well as guaranteed safe passage across roads between Gaza and the West Bank. That, in effect, Palestinians could travel throughout Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank, and between them, never having to meet Israeli border control agents or pass through Israeli territory. That's what's shown on the right. And both of these maps, by the way, come from Ross's book entitled The Missing Piece. So what is the difference between what the Palestinians see and say was described and what Ross and the Israelis see and say was described? Well, clearly the difference is this line across here and this line across here, which are certainly suggested by the white area and by the white area here, but which the Israelis and Ross say stopped there, and which the Palestinians say would have extended all the way to the Jordan River, effectively cutting Palestine in 3. What are we looking at? The white areas, the dotted line, first of all, you should recognize by now, that's the green line, right? That's the 1967 ceasefire lines. And the gray area is the West Bank. Where the gray area has been whited out is territory that the Israelis at Camp David proposed annexing to Israel. Why did they propose annexing those areas to Israel? Because the black areas on this map represent Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Israeli communities that have been built in the West Bank from 1967 to the present, and which currently include approximately 275,000 Israeli citizens. The Israelis are saying, well, there are 4 major settlement blocks, one around Bethlehem, one around and to the north of Jerusalem, one up here just below Qalqilia, and one up in the north, where, yes, we would, in final negotiations, want to annex those settlements to Israel, and in exchange, probably give land, Israeli land, down adjacent to or close to Gaza, to the Palestinians to annex to Palestine, so that there would be something of a land swap. In order for Israel to be able to maintain those 4 settlement blocks. The Palestinians have said, no, that's not what you said. What you said was that you would maintain your settlements all the way over to the Jordan River and also maintain a military presence along the Jordan River as a buffer against any potential attack from the east. And that is what effectively cuts Palestine into 4 different cantons. As I said, there are no maps from Camp David, so these are representations by David Ross And actually, you can also find them on Palestine Media Watch and the website of the Palestinian Negotiating Authority. You can certainly find this one there. Ross offers this one in his book to reflect his understanding and substantially the Israelis' understanding of what they were offering. So it's the settlements that are at issue. And so just to give you a sense of that, this is a map from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, which shows in blue the Israeli settlements throughout the West Bank. And you can see the concentration here, which represents this area on Ross's map, the concentration here, which represents this area on Ross's map, the area north of and around Jerusalem, which is this area, and the area south of Bethlehem, the so-called, especially the so-called Etzion block, which is actually a group of Israeli communities that were there before 1948, and which Israel lost to Jordan in the fighting of the 1948-49 war. After 1967, those communities were reestablished by Israel, and they're known as the Etzion block. And they have a somewhat different status only because they pre-exist, as Jewish communities, they pre-exist the 1948 war. And so there's a recognition that they are somewhat different in terms of Israel's connection to them than these others, which are all products post-1967. Okay. So you can see the connection between the density of the settlement activity and the areas that Ross says Israel was expecting or presenting for annexation at Camp David. Now, what we do have a map of is the so-called Clinton parameters. After the talks at Camp David failed in the late summer, conversations continued, and on December 23rd, President Clinton, in really a last-ditch effort to try to pull out a final agreement, sent parameters to both the Palestinians and the Israelis saying, you know, here's what we heard at Camp David as meeting sort of minimum demands, minimum expectations, minimum needs on both sides of the negotiations. And can you accept these parameters as the basis for coming to a final agreement? This is what Ross presents as the Clinton parameters. You can see that essentially it's the same. This is the same map we just had before of what Ross says was the Israeli proposal. You can see it's essentially the same, except that Clinton was allowing for a much more filigreed connection of the Israeli settlements and not just taking out chunks of territory in order to sort of enclose blocks of settlements in large areas. And so the question arose, again, Dennis Ross's presentation, when Clinton sent these off, Ehud Barak, then the prime minister, and the Israeli cabinet accepted them, but the Palestinians, in looking at this and considering the whole course of the negotiations up to that point, could not finally accept them. One last topic, the separation barrier. There are many who would say that the separation barrier defines a border. If so, what does that border represent? Well, you can see very closely it represents the Clinton parameters. There are 4 major settlement blocks, and in erecting a wall and a fence, there are varying percentages given, but somewhere around 93 to 97% fence, 3 to 7% wall. But in erecting this barrier in the name of security, Israel has enclosed those settlement blocks which it would seek to annex in a final agreement. This would generally afford about 92% of the West Bank for Palestine, again with land in the south adjacent to Gaza in exchange for the settlement land. But what about all the other settlements? I mean, it's one thing to talk about these 4 blocks. What about, this is the settlement map from Bar-Ilan University showing broadly all of the settlements across the West Bank, and in green what they call settlement zones of influence. What about all of that? If it's really papered over with settlements the way this shows, and we saw some of that in the blue on the B'Tselem map previously, how is it credible to say, well, these 4 settlement blocks are all that Israel really seeks to annex in a final agreement? It seems pretty daunting. But if you look at the demographics, at population figures from 2007 for all of the settlements, it turns out that more than 80% of all the West Bank settlers live in these 4 settlement blocks. About 275,000 Israelis living in the West Bank, and more than 80% live in those 4 blocks. In the land that the Clinton parameters would cede to Israel in final negotiations. Of approximately 275,000 Israelis in all of the West Bank, that means 220,000 are in these 4 areas, and it leaves 55,000 Israelis scattered among about 2.5 million Palestinians in 160 plus settlements through the rest of the West Bank. And so the question of whether Israel can do that is the question of whether Israel can relocate 55,000 of its residents back inside Green Line and annexed territory subsequent to reaching final agreement. Well, the one example that we have, maybe not the one, but one example that we have of the possibility of that comes from the Gaza Strip. This again is from B'Tselem, the human rights organization. And what's in pink here is Israeli settlements and military control zones in the Gaza Strip in 2005. It was late in 2005, well, August actually, that every one of these settlements was evacuated and the residents were relocated back into Green Line, Israel, and the whole of the Gaza Strip was left for the Palestinian Authority to govern. So at least on this scale, it can be done. The negotiations, from what we hear from leading both Palestinian and Israeli diplomats, the negotiations for final settlement have actually been going exceptionally well. They're really quite promising at this point. We can only hope and pray that they're brought to a conclusion soon, so that one day soon I can offer you a final map that shows the borders of Israel and Palestine projected as stable well into the future, God willing. So I promised you a bit of a summary at the end. 6 key moments that I would suggest we can focus on through the years to understand Israel and Palestine and their borders. First of all, the biblical period, we have the beginnings of Peleshit and Israel, and the names come onto, and the territories come onto the horizon for us. 135 CE, Hadrian chooses Palestina as the name for the whole area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, and that really sets the geopolitical terminology substantially on down to the 20th century. 1922, the League of Nations, in its Palestine mandate, identifies all of what's west of the Jordan and what's east of the Jordan as Palestine mandate for Britain, and Britain carves off what's east of the Jordan as Transjordan and into Hashemite sovereignty, which gets formalized in 1946. So then in 1946 to 48, Jordan is established. The UN proposes partition for a Jewish and an Arab state, unnamed, and modern Israel declares its independence and names itself Israel. 1964 to 74, we see the founding of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and by 1964 is the founding. By 74, it's been recognized by the Arab League as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and so we can really talk about the modern Palestinian political emergence in that period. Not to say that it doesn't have antecedents. There are those who would argue, and it's plausible, that there's a kind of Palestinian political identity already in the 1830s when the Ottomans lost the territory to Muhammad Ali, the first one, from Egypt, and then the local population, the Palestinians, revolted against his oldest son, Ibrahim Pasha. And that there really was a coalescing of a Palestinian peoplehood in the 1830s in that political movement. So it's not that there aren't antecedents, but in terms of the contemporary conflict, the Palestinians emerge politically, not just from behind Israel, but also from behind Jordan and the Ottomans and others who have been involved in the region in this period of 1964 to 74. And then finally, in 2000, the Camp David summit and the Clinton parameters proposing final status borders, or parameters to establish final status borders and create the two-state solution to which the Palestinian Authority and Israel have both committed themselves. So that's the summary. I appreciate your keeping your seatbelts fastened, and hopefully we didn't lose anybody along the way, out one side or the other, but there it is. Where do you want to draw the lines in the sand? Thank you.
In view of the fact that you said that the negotiations are going very well with those settlements on the West Bank, between the negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis are going well. What exactly is it that the Gazan Palestinians are hoping to get with their constant bombardment of Israel? If the final goal seems to be achievable, why are they jumping the gun, so to speak?
Honest people will differ on answers to that question. But my own reading of the situation is that the leadership in Gaza under the Hamas banner has really rejected the Palestinian Authority's legitimacy as the representative of the Palestinian people. There is a very deep political divide among Palestinians today. Between those who support the Palestinian Authority, which is largely a product of the Fatah movement, and the Hamas, who have developed a very different political philosophy. And in 2006, in the Palestinian elections, Hamas was elected to a majority in the Palestinian National Authority. However, that's been exceedingly problematic because most of the major Western powers identify Hamas as a terrorist organization. And therefore, there, shall we say, certain impediments to recognizing the Palestinian National Authority and the PA in its, if it is controlled by Hamas. So what we're seeing, and that of course brings even greater, puts even greater pressure on Hamas, who entered a power-sharing government, a unity government with Fatah in the Palestinian Authority subsequent to the elections, but then sort of blew up that agreement and drove all of the Fatah PA security forces out of Gaza about a year and a half ago, if I have my timeline right, and has taken effective control of Gaza I think from the standpoint of the Palestinian Authority, you would have to say as a renegade district of Palestine. And so what you have is a recognized government-like entity, the Palestinian Authority, centered in Ramallah in the West Bank with Mahmoud Abbas as its president, and a Gaza district which is controlled by Hamas, which rejects both the legitimacy of the PA and rejects its posture of negotiation with the Israelis. So if we all breathe a sigh of relief and feel good about the report that negotiations between Israel and the PA are going well, Hamas sees that as an enormous setback for the cause of Palestinian independence. And so I think what has been going on is that Hamas continues to try to assert its position and authority within the Palestinian and Arab world by maintaining its armed resistance to Israel and its rejection of Israel and its rejection of a two-state solution as anything that the future should hold.
I read about Palestinians being refugees and a mentality of having lost land. What role does that play in the stance that Hamas may be holding on to in this conflict?
Well, I think it plays a large role in any view of the conflict that would say that Israel is an illegitimate presence. If the perception is that the UN had no right to partition the Palestine Mandate when the British gave it up, and that therefore any Israeli presence is illegitimate, then everybody whose family lived in what became Green Line Israel prior to 1948, everybody who lived there and now lives elsewhere can be considered a refugee by some definition. And we could do an entire First Friday on the various definitions of refugee. A refugee is not a refugee everywhere in the world. There are legal definitions of who's a refugee, and part of it depends on where you are, and part of it depends on where you came from, and part of it depends on when that happened. And so there is no single definition of refugee in international law. It's which refugees are we talking about. But I think that, for those who see the 1947 partition that way, I think that plays a major role. There are those among the Palestinians, I don't know what the percentage is, but there are those who consider that all of what is west of the Jordan River is Palestine, and that's what has to be liberated. There are those within Israel, and I don't know how many they are. I think in both cases these are minorities, small minorities. There are those within Israel who say everything between the Mediterranean and the Jordan is Israel and should come under Israeli sovereignty, and probably would happen better if there were no Arabs living there. But the polls that we have from both communities are, both West Bank and Israel, are that over approximately or slightly more than 70% of both populations want a two-state solution, with Israelis and Palestinians each having their own national homeland, living side by side in a demilitarized relationship with economic cooperation and peaceful coexistence. That's what the majority of both populations wants. Let me just say too, one of the pieces that I didn't emphasize, and I do think it's worth noticing, is that we tend to look at the founding of the State of Israel as a decision of the United Nations, as I just reflected it, right? That the UN created Israel with the partition plan. In fact, I would argue that that is not the case, that the UN provided no material support to the Jewish people at the time of the partition or of the British withdrawal, They didn't move a single Jew into the area. They didn't provide any military force to do anything about what would happen after the British withdrew. All the UN did was draw a provisional line, green line, and offer it to the Arabs and the Jews as the basis on which to establish two states. What created the state of Israel is the same thing that created just about every other state that I know of in the world. And that is the people who lived in that land fought a battle against people who lived nearby and wanted it. And one day the battle ended and they drew the boundaries. That's what created the state of Israel, not a UN gift.
Excuse me. I've heard that an economic blockade has been imposed by Israel upon Gaza. And referring to the first question, why are Hamas militants shelling Israel with rockets? Would you regard the economic blockade as one of the reasons for the hostility? The economic blockade, as I understand it, prevents such things as fuel for generators entering Gaza so that, for example, people in hospitals can be kept alive while their generators are running. Could that be behind any of the hostility that prompts people in Gaza to fire rockets into Israel?
I really have to answer the question that you ask with a no. I don't believe the economic blockade is why Hamas is firing rockets at Israel. Does the blockade of the naval blockade and to a certain extent the land blockade increase feelings of hostility, resentment, anger, frustration, etc.? And does that then feed into the violence that comes out of Gaza? Absolutely. But I think it's crucial to understand that this is a war. Right? There is no other way to describe this than that Israel and now Hamas are at war with each other. And that in the context of a war, both combatants undertake actions which antagonize and hurt the combatants on the other side. Ideally, the damage is done primarily to combatants, although it's a time-honored principle of war that undermining infrastructure is one key way to gain advantage over your enemy combatants. We don't have the time today to look at the specifics of Hamas's attacks or Israel's embargoes and blockades and such like. But I think that a thorough analysis of that would be a worthwhile undertaking in trying to assess how this war is being conducted by both parties. But yeah, does the blockade create the rocket fire? No. The rocket fire is primarily ideologically motivated. And Hamas has said that. They have sworn themselves to armed resistance against the legitimacy of the state of Israel and its control of the territory. That's what fundamentally motivates the rocket fire. Does Israel's response to that in military and infrastructure terms exacerbate the situation? Sure. War is hell.
Without discussing Jerusalem, but some people call that the ultimate problem in the settlement. And there are lines, de facto lines within the city of Jerusalem. What do they suggest as being the possible settlement of those lines which aren't in the sand?
Can you help me with a little bit more, Tom? I'm not sure if I'm missing your question.
Well, within Jerusalem, there
Right.
are lines, neighborhood lines.
Right.
Three religions
Right.
live in separate sections,
Right.
and they have for centuries. What is the possible solution brought up by people as to the future of Jerusalem?
Well, that's a big question, and there are a lot of different proposals. What the Clinton parameters proposed was that Israel would be municipally integrated, but that East Jerusalem would be controlled by the Arab population, the Palestinian population, and would be the capital of the state of Palestine. It is possible to draw the lines through the city, and if people are living as peaceful neighbors with each other, you can draw political divisions right down the middle of a street, and neighbors on both sides may have different garbage collection and water rates and fire departments that respond, but they live as neighbors under those two different political systems. And I think ultimately that's what has to be envisioned for Jerusalem, that Palestinian communities would be a part of Palestine, Jewish communities would be a part of Israel, and political responsibility would be divided, perhaps in some kind of shared municipality. But I'm not privy to where those conversations are going right now. What I do know is that as recently as 2 months ago when I was there and we were talking with some people in the negotiations, both from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Palestinian Authority, they both said that, and I heard it again from Ambassador Avital, one of the deputy speakers of the Knesset this week, those conversations have made a lot of progress. One of the things that persuades me that that's an accurate report is that I haven't heard much about the details of what's going on in them. And there's a principle in negotiating, I think, that when it's going well, there are no leaks. Because you don't want public opinion to screw it up. So if you start hearing a lot about people's positions and who's asking for what and who's proposing what and how it can work out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can pretty well count on the fact that it's all broken down. And folks are looking for public opinion to influence where the next round of negotiations starts. If it's quiet, it's probably going pretty well. And that's also the report that I've heard.
Yeah, I have one question concerning, is there somebody behind Hamas in the Arab community, various countries who are enabling it to be as forceful as it is? And if that's the case, who might those entities be?
The best we can tell, Hamas is backed by Iran, which is not an Arab state. But it seems pretty clear that Iran is the principal state partner that Hamas has. There are those who have suggested that one of the reasons that there has not been a more forceful outcry from Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and Syria with respect to what's been going on over the last couple of weeks, is that what Hamas represents is politically as much a challenge to their own status quo as it is to Israel. And so there are those who have suggested that there's been a kind of willingness to stand aside and not rally to the side of Hamas in this instance because Israel's degrading of Hamas's capabilities actually serves the interest of a number of the neighboring Arab states.
Thank you, Dr. Pettit.